I never imagined a single phone call could change the rest of my life. The phone rang in the middle of a sweltering afternoon, and just as I was about to pick it up, I realized my son, Jacob, was talking to someone. On speakerphone, by mistake. I froze when I heard his voice. It was as cold as steel. "I'm going to push the old man out of the company. He's useless now." I thought I'd heard him wrong. The old man. Was that me? His father? The man who'd worked for 45 years to build the company he now ran? Reduced to a useless old man. On the other end, I heard the sharp, shrill laugh of Paula, his wife. "It's about time, honey. Your dad is living in another century. If you don't do it, the company's going to die with him." I still remember every word, every beat of that cruel laughter. The room seemed to freeze, despite the scorching sun pouring through the window. I just stood there, motionless, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening as they meticulously planned my removal from the life's work I had built with my own blood and sweat. Jacob continued, in the flat tone of someone closing a business deal. "We'll tell him to retire, that it's best for his health. He doesn't need to know about the changes." Hearing that, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. My son. He'd forgotten that before I was a boss, I was the father who carried him on my shoulders, who'd worked through the night so he'd never lack a hot meal or a new pair of shoes for school. I don't remember how long I sat there after the call ended. I just know the ticking of the wall clock was marking a countdown. The countdown of my days at that company. My office, a place that had always felt like home, suddenly felt alien. On the wall, the family photos felt as heavy as rocks. In one, a little Jacob was laughing with a gap-toothed grin, sitting on my shoulders. In another, on his wedding day, Mary, my wife, was hugging us both, her warm gaze like a blessing. Now the two people I had loved most in my life were gone. One passed away. The other, fading slowly from my heart. I stood up and walked slowly to my desk, the same one that had seen so many sleepless nights of running numbers, of signing every contract with my own calloused hands. I ran my hand over the wood surface, cool and smooth, and remembered the early days when the company was nothing more than a small workshop, full of sawdust and the smell of varnish. I started with $50 in my pocket and a dream that, until that moment, I thought I was building for my son. Now that same dream was being appraised by him. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and drank it down in one gulp, tasting nothing but bitterness. In my mind, only Mary's voice echoed, as if she were whispering in my ear, "Honey, don't let them trample on your kindness." I looked at her photograph and nodded slightly. No, I wouldn't let them turn me into a ghost in my own life. But I wasn't going to scream or cry either. I had taught my son that in business, the smartest person knows when to stay silent. This time I was going to teach him that lesson again, but I was going to do it as a father. I remember the day I decided to open my first small woodworking shop like it was yesterday. I was only 26. I had exactly $50 in my pocket and a wife who believed in me more than anyone in the world. Mary. She used to say, "John, if you work with your heart, the wood will listen to your hands." I carried those words with me my whole life. At first, the shop was just 4 crumbling walls and an old table saw I bought from a neighbor. But in our eyes, it was the future. Every morning, I'd get up before sunrise, make Mary a cup of coffee, and start sawing, sanding, and varnishing every plank of wood. My hands were swollen and covered in calluses, but I never complained. I wasn't doing it out of ambition, but for a simple wish, that my son, who hadn't even been born yet, wouldn't have to live like I had. Mary, who was pregnant with Jacob at the time, her belly already round and tight, would sit by my side every night, helping me stick on labels, run the numbers, and keep the books. Every so often, she'd look up and smile tenderly. Our son will grow up smelling like sawdust and sweat, but also like love, Right, honey. When Jacob was born, I held him in my arms in the middle of the workshop. The particles of sawdust floating in the sunbeam were like thousands of tiny stars. I kissed his forehead and made a promise. I'll do everything I can to give you a better future than your father had. That oath stayed with me for the next few decades, turning into sleepless nights, trips to deliver orders in the middle of the night, and the aches that settled into my back from all the heavy lifting. I thought that if I just sacrificed a little more, Jacob would have it all: a good education, quality clothes, and not a single worry in the world. Over time, the small workshop grew into a company. I went from being a craftsman to a manager, and finally, an owner. But deep down, I never felt like a boss. I was just an old carpenter who still believed that every product was a part of himself. And Mary, she was still the quiet hands behind the scenes, keeping everything in order and full of warmth. When Jacob was little, he used to run around the shop, playing and asking questions. "Dad, why does the wood smell so good?" I'd laugh and tell him, "Because it's alive, son. Wood has a soul, just like people." I never imagined that one day that same boy would forget the soul of what his father had created. Looking back now, I understand that maybe I taught him too well how to make money. But I forgot to teach him to value the effort and the love. I gave him everything, except my time. When the company opened new branches, I barely made it home. Every time Mary begged me, "Just stay home one day, John. Jacob wants to go to the park with his dad," I'd always answer, "Next time, honey. I have to lock in this contract." I thought that as soon as I closed that deal, I'd have time for my son. But next time never came. Looking back, I see those years as a time that was both beautiful and cruel. Beautiful, because I loved with all my heart. Cruel, because that same love blinded me. I built a solid building, but I left the most important room empty, the one where a father and son could sit together, just to say, "I love you, and I'm proud of you." When the company started turning a profit, I thought I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But in reality, that was just the beginning of another journey, the journey of a man who didn't know how to stop. Every morning, I was still the first one to arrive and the last one to leave the shop. The younger employees looked at me with admiration, and I could only smile. They didn't understand that I wasn't working for praise. I was working because I was afraid that if I stopped, everything would collapse. Jacob grew up having dinners without a father. When I got home, he was already asleep. When I left for work, he was still dreaming. Mary used to tell me that every time he heard a noise at the door, he'd run over asking, "Is Dad home?" And when he saw it was just the wind, he'd go back silently, hugging his old teddy bear. Hearing that hurt my soul, but I'd console myself by thinking, he'll understand one day. When he sees everything I've built for him, he'll be proud. When Jacob turned 12, the company hit its first major revenue milestone. I had promised Mary we'd take a few days off for vacation, but I ended up canceling everything for an important contract. She didn't get angry. She just looked at me sadly. "You're winning in business, John, but you're losing in life," she said quietly. I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating. Now, remembering it, I think that sentence was a prophecy I deliberately ignored. I only felt the true weight of her words when Mary got sick. She was suffering from heart failure and had to be hospitalized constantly. Every time she held my hand, she'd say, "John, stop. I'm afraid one day you'll lose everything because you don't know how to stop." But I kept making empty promises. "I just need to sign this one last project." I signed it, yes. But a few months later, I lost her forever. I still remember the night of the funeral. Jacob, a grown man by then, hugged me and said through his tears, "I promise I won't leave you alone, Dad." And I believed him. I believed his promise. I saw Mary's reflection in my son's eyes, a steady, loving gaze. I trusted that, even though she was gone, this family still had Jacob. I still had a father-son love I could lean on in my old age. But I never suspected that this same love, this same faith, would become my greatest weakness. Because I never learned how to rest, it was only when others started wishing for my departure that I realized one thing. I had gotten old, but I had never lived a single day for myself. After Mary's funeral, the house felt strangely empty. Every morning, I'd still make 2 cups of coffee out of habit, only to realize there was no one sitting across from me to smile back. The smell of the white lilies on the mantel mixed with the scent of the wood in the picture frames, making the room feel like it was holding its breath forever. The nights were so quiet I could hear every tick of the clock, as if it were reminding me that I had just lost the most important part of my life. Jacob moved in with me for a while. Back then, I considered myself lucky to still have my son by my side. He helped me organize paperwork, took me out to dinner, and we'd talk about the company's growth. "You don't have to worry anymore, Dad. I can take it from here," he'd say, his voice full of confidence. My heart felt comforted. In the midst of my loneliness, at least I still had family. But little by little, the father-son talks became less frequent, replaced by closed-door meetings between Jacob and his wife, Paula. Paula was an intelligent and shrewd woman, but she always gave off a cold perfume. When Mary was still alive, she had whispered to me once, "That girl doesn't love Jacob. She loves power." I had laughed, thinking Mary was worrying too much. Now I understood. Every time Paula looked at me, her eyes seemed to be calculating what percentage of the stock I had left to sign over. One night, I left my office earlier than usual. The light from the living room spilled into the hallway, and I heard Paula whisper, "If your father would just agree to sell the rest of his shares, we could expand internationally. Tell me, would you dare to ask him?" Jacob was silent for a moment, then answered, "Dad will never let it go. But if we could prove he's not fully competent." I stopped, feeling as if an invisible fist were squeezing my heart. I didn't hear the end of the sentence. I didn't need to. Half of it was enough to understand that Mary had been right. I was no longer a loved one. I was an obstacle in their plans. That night I sat alone on the porch and opened the notebook Mary used to leave, half full. Tucked between pages of recipes, I found a folded note, written in her soft handwriting. "Honey, if one day I'm not by your side, remember that this house will only stay alive as long as there's love in it. Don't let the numbers kill you, and don't let them kill our son." I read that sentence over and over, and each time the lump in my throat grew bigger. I thought I knew my wife, but it turned out I never really did. She had seen it all coming. My loneliness and the greed that would grow in our son if I kept using material things to show my love. The next morning, I got up early, made a cup of coffee, and placed another one next to Mary's portrait. "Do you see it?" I whispered. "The boy is taking the path we feared so much. But this time, I won't stay silent." The sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating her photograph. Looking at her smile, I thought I heard her warm, familiar voice. "It's time for you to live for yourself, John." From that day on, I started paying closer attention to Jacob and Paula's behavior. Before, every time I walked into the conference room, everyone would stand up to greet me, and Jacob would introduce me with pride. "This is my father, the founder." But lately, when I opened the door, the conversations would stop abruptly, and their faces would fill with a fleeting discomfort. Jacob would just nod with a forced smile and continue his presentation, without even inviting me to sit down. I realized it wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. A way of pushing me aside, little by little. Paula was different. She was always polite, proper, but cold as steel. "Mr. Harrison, how are you today?" she'd say, as if I were a business partner and not her father-in-law. Every time I heard her, my heart sank. I didn't want to believe my son was being manipulated by this woman. But all the signs were pointing in that direction. One day I passed by the conference room and saw Jacob presenting a restructuring plan for the company. On the screen, I read the words, "New Strategic Direction." Below, in the notes, I managed to read, "Optimize leadership and ensure generational transition." Every word was like a knife in the gut. Generational transition. They were planning to replace me, publicly and legally. They were just waiting for me to sign the document myself, for the common good. I stood at the door for a few minutes, watching my son speak passionately to the young shareholders. I had dreamed of seeing this scene, my son, confident, leading the company forward. But the pride I once felt was gone, replaced by a deep sense of emptiness. I no longer saw the boy who used to collect sawdust to help his dad. I saw a man with a thirst for power so great that he had forgotten the roots of his own success. When the meeting ended, Jacob saw me. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're in early, Dad," he said, trying to keep his tone light. I nodded and answered slowly, "Yes, I wanted to hear where my son's company is headed." Jacob forced a smile, looking away. "We're just considering a few small changes, adapting to the new times." I didn't answer. I just looked at him. For a long, long time. Between us, an invisible distance was growing. We weren't father and son anymore, just two estranged colleagues talking business. In the afternoon, I returned to my office. On the desk, the old clock Mary had given me was still ticking, its sound heavy in the room. I looked through the glass and saw Jacob and Paula crossing the courtyard, talking and laughing. Their smiles were bright, but I saw something foreign in them, something as cold as the glint of steel. I sighed, opened a drawer, and took out an old notebook. I quickly scribbled a few lines. "Son, I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was watching my life's work crumble. But no. The worst thing is watching your own son become a stranger. I don't blame you, but it hurts, Jacob. It hurts a lot." I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Outside, the pale evening light spread across the office walls. I realized that what was fading wasn't just the daylight, but also a father's faith in the son he once believed would carry on his legacy with love, not ambition. That morning, while I was reviewing some old contracts, the phone rang. The screen showed the name Michael Miller. He was my friend of over 20 years and the head accountant for the company. His voice sounded rough, laced with hesitation. "John, I need to see you. Urgently. Something's not right." I met him immediately at the little diner across the street from the company, the place we always went when we needed to get away from the office. Michael showed up a few minutes late, his face tense, a far cry from his usual calm. He set his coffee down on the table and lowered his voice. "Jacob, your son. He's been asking me about the company's legal structure. He wanted to know how to redistribute the shares without your consent." I went numb. "Without my consent?" Michael nodded slowly. At first I thought it was just curiosity, but then he brought in a young lawyer. They asked in detail about the shareholdings, power of attorney, and even about the possibility of proving your incapacity to lead. "John, I think you need to be careful." I sat in silence as the coffee in front of me grew cold. What I had just heard was like a blade twisting deeper inside me. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Are you sure, Michael? Maybe he's just preparing for the future." Michael looked me straight in the eye with an honesty that hurt. "I'd like to believe that. But you and I both know Jacob isn't that kid anymore. The way he looked at me while we were talking, it was the look of someone calculating, not a son worried about his father." We were quiet for a moment, the sound of street traffic mixed with the whistling wind against the diner's windows. Finally, Michael added, "John, you've always trusted people, especially your son. But don't forget, this company is your entire life. If you don't protect it, others will turn it into just another commodity. something to be bought and sold like anything else. His words reminded me of something Mary told me years ago. You love your work so much that if anyone touched it, you'd feel like they were touching your very heart. Back then, she said it to advise me to learn to let go. Now that same sentence echoed as a different kind of warning. If I wasn't careful, the first person to stab that heart would be someone who carried the Harrison name. After Michael left, I stayed behind. A light rain began to fall, the drops making patterns on the glass tabletop, like scars on a memory. I remembered the first time I taught Jacob to sign a small contract. He was only 25, and his hand was shaking as he held the pen. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "In business, you can lose money, but you must never lose your dignity." Now, remembering that, the words sounded like a reminder for myself. That dignity, once betrayed, cannot be bought back at any price. I decided not to confront Jacob right away. I needed to know more. I needed to prepare. If he really wanted to snatch his father's legacy, he wouldn't do it without learning a lesson. But unlike other times, I wouldn't face him with anger. I would do it with reason, with the silence that Mary once called the weapon of a wounded father. I looked up at the window. The raindrops reflected my image on the glass. A 71-year-old man, his hair completely white, his gaze tired, but never defeated. I whispered to myself, "Jacob, you're walking down a more dangerous path than you know. And this time, I'm going to let you discover for yourself what it means to lose everything." That night, I went back to the company after everyone else had left. The fluorescent lights reflected off the cold tile floor, casting my thin shadow all the way down the hall. The office was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. I sat in my familiar swivel chair in front of the filing cabinets, which for 45 years I had guarded like treasure. I opened the bottom drawer where I kept the most important documents: the property deeds, the sales contracts, the stock certificates, the meeting minutes. Every piece of paper held a part of my life: sweat, tears, and even the dreams I once had for Jacob. I reviewed every folder, every signature, every clause, as if I were re-examining my own youth. It turned out I still owned 85% of the company's stock. Jacob only had 15%, the part I had gifted him 5 years ago, back when I thought it was the best way to show a father's trust. "This is a gift, so you can learn to lead," I had told him. He had beamed. He'd hugged me and said, "I'll make you proud, Dad." That sentence now echoed in my head like a cruel irony. While I laughed, I had said, "Keep this, so that in the future, father and son will have something to remind you that love can also create wealth." I smiled faintly, but the smile faded quickly. Now Jacob no longer wanted to remember those beginnings. To him, the company was just an asset, not the soul of a family. Maybe the fault wasn't just his, but mine, too, for teaching him how to succeed, but forgetting to teach him to be grateful. I poured a glass of whiskey, took a small sip, and opened another folder. The letters Mary sent me when I was away on business. One of them, from 1995, in her soft, delicate handwriting, said, "Honey, I know you work so we can have a future, but the future isn't always ahead of you. Sometimes it's right beside you, and you don't see it." I folded the letter and put it in my shirt pocket. Every word from Mary was like a needle stitching up the emptiness in my chest. A pain that was, at the same time, a comfort. The clock struck 12. I turned on the computer. I accessed the electronic records and reviewed all the deeds. Everything was clear. I was the only person with the power to make the final decision. Thinking about it, I sighed. Now I understood why Jacob was so anxious to carry out that generational transition. In his eyes, I was the barrier standing between him and absolute power. The light flickered. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the rain falling outside. I remembered Michael's words, Mary's words, and all the signs I had tried to ignore for so long. Maybe it was time to stop being an indulgent father and go back to being a man who knows how to protect himself. I put the documents away, locked the drawer, and stood up to look around the room. This is where all my dreams began. Now perhaps it would also be the place where I closed one chapter of my life to open a new one where affection would no longer be seen as a weakness. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. It wasn't quite dawn yet. The dew still covered the window panes, and the house was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking. I made myself a coffee, a habit I could never break, and sat down to look at Mary's photograph on the table. "Honey," I whispered, "I think it's time to do something I never thought I'd do." She didn't answer, but her gentle smile in the photo gave me the strength I needed. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for George Hill, my lawyer, and the only trusted friend I had left. We had known each other since 1995, when my company barely had a few employees and George was still a young lawyer. He had been by my side for every major contract and knew the legal ins and outs of this business better than anyone. When his voice came on the line, deep and familiar, I felt as if I had just grabbed a rope pulling me out of an abyss. "John, what a surprise. This early?" he asked, his tone halfway between cheerful and worried. I didn't answer right away. I took a deep breath and told him everything. I told him about the phone call I'd overheard, about Michael's warning, about Jacob's plans to seize control, and his attempt to prove I was no longer competent. On the other end, George was silent. Every so often, he'd ask for a detail. Dates, names, any document I might have signed in recent years. When I finished, he sighed. "John, I knew this would happen sooner or later, but not like this. Your son, he's changed a lot." "Maybe it was my fault, George," I replied quietly. "I taught him how to manage, how to win negotiations, but I forgot to teach him how to be honest." "No," he interrupted. "This isn't a question of morality anymore. It's a matter of strategy. If Jacob is really trying to prove you're incapacitated, you have to act first. We'll prepare a file to legally protect your interests, and if necessary, we can consider a more drastic measure." "More drastic?" I asked, though I already guessed the answer. "Sell the company, John. Sell it all before they can take it from you, so that you're the one taking the initiative, not the victim." I fell silent. The idea was as painful as it was liberating. I looked around my office. Every corner, every object, tied to memories of Mary, of my youth, of the faith that Jacob would continue my legacy with his heart, not with tricks. Selling the company was like tearing out a part of my soul. But then I remembered Paula's laugh and Jacob's icy voice on the phone. That old man is useless. If they saw me as old merchandise, then I would be the one to set the final price. "You have 48 hours to think about it," George continued, his voice firm. "If you decide to do it, I'll handle all the paperwork. But remember, once you sign, there's no going back." I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see me. "Thanks, George. This time I'm not letting anyone else decide for me." After hanging up, I sat motionless for a long time. The first light of day was creeping through the crack in the door, illuminating Mary's photo. I thought I heard her voice whispering, "If they don't know how to value it, teach them a lesson from a place of serenity." I took a sip of my cold coffee, my gaze lost on the streets that were just beginning to fill with life. A plan was starting to form, not for revenge, but to reclaim what I had lost long ago, the right to be respected. That afternoon I drove without a destination. The highway heading downtown was packed with people, but I wasn't going anywhere. Without realizing it, I turned onto a small street that led to the old park, the same place I used to take Jacob when he was barely 5 years old. I stopped the car and sat in silence, watching through the windshield as the old oak trees cast the same shadows they did 30 years ago. The only difference was that the child who used to run across the grass holding my hand had become the man who had cracked my heart. And now I was hearing them again, not from that child's mouth, but from the wind blowing through the trees, reminding me of a distant past I could no longer return to. Then I sat on an old stone bench, feeling the cold cement through my shirt. Across from me, a group of kids was playing soccer, shouting with joy. A young father was chasing his son, laughing and saying, "Watch out, you're gonna fall." That simple scene squeezed my chest. I had been that father too, full of enthusiasm and pride, convinced that love and responsibility would protect my family forever. I spoke to myself in a low voice. "Jacob, you were that little boy. You once believed that taking care of your parents was the most sacred thing. When did you forget that?" I got no answer, only the rustling of the leaves as if the park were trying to comfort me. I pulled Mary's small note from my pocket, the one I'd carried since I opened the file cabinet. Her soft handwriting said, "John, if one day our son loses his way, don't try to find him with accusations. Let him get lost enough so he can understand on his own where his home truly is." I looked up at the grayish sky. Maybe Mary had foreseen this too. Maybe she understood that I needed to learn how to lose in order to love again, not with blind faith, but with the serenity of someone who has endured it all. A little boy ran by, and his ball rolled to my feet. I bent down to pick it up and tossed it back to him with a smile. "Thanks, mister," he said in an innocent voice. I watched him run off, and suddenly I realized I had just genuinely smiled for the first time in days. When the sun began to set behind the trees, I stood up. I felt an emptiness inside, but it was no longer despair. It was the stillness of someone who knows a chapter of his life is coming to an end. I headed back toward the company, thinking about George's words. "You have 48 hours to decide." And in that instant, I knew I already had the answer. Not to win, but to preserve the only thing I had left: a father's honor and his memories. That evening, just as I got home, my phone rang. The screen showed the name Isabella. Just seeing it brought a sense of calm over me. Her voice came through the line, clear and full of worry. "Grandpa, are you okay? You've seemed so sad lately." I smiled slightly, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Grandpa's just a little tired." "Are you lying?" she interrupted immediately. "I can hear in your voice it's more than sadness. At home, Dad and Mom won't stop whispering, and every time I walk into the room, they get quiet." I fell silent. This granddaughter of mine, ever since she was little, had been as sharp as the wind. "Have you heard anything, Isabella?" I asked softly. She hesitated for a second, then confessed. "I heard Dad say you're losing your touch, and that the company needs someone younger. Mom said it was time for you to retire and rest. But Grandpa, I don't believe them. I see you. You're sharp. You're just sad." Her voice was trembling, and I felt my own eyes well up with tears. I never imagined that, in the middle of that house full of calculations, there was still a heart so pure. "Thank you, Isabella," I said slowly. "There are things adults do that children don't always need to understand, but I'm glad to know you still trust me." "No," she replied instantly. "It's not that I trust you. It's that I know. I've seen you in your office, talking to people. You listen. You never yell at anyone. Dad, he only knows how to give orders. You're different, Grandpa." I smiled, but my smile mixed with tears. "Sweetheart, your father isn't a bad person. He's just forgotten the most important thing." "What is?" "That success without love means nothing." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Isabella sighed. "Grandpa, if I were Dad, I would never hurt you. I promise." I chuckled softly. "Just you saying that is enough. Just remember one thing. Adults can lose everything, but they must never lose their kindness." We talked for a while longer about school and the puppy she had just adopted. I listened to her laugh and realized it sounded exactly like Mary's. Pure, warm, without a hint of calculation. When we hung up, I stared at the phone screen, feeling as if I'd just received a balm for my soul. I got up and went out to the porch. The night sky covered the city in an indigo blanket, and the twinkling lights looked like countless memories. I looked up and whispered, "Do you see, Mary? There's still a heart in our bloodline that knows how to love." The wind blew gently through the screen, a caress I felt as her tender reply. I sat down in the wooden chair. I opened my leather notebook and wrote, "Isabella called me today. She is a small light in a world that was being devoured by the darkness of greed." Thanks to her, I remember that not all is lost. If I can still teach one lesson, it will be for her, that sincere love is more powerful than any contract. I closed the notebook and looked up at the company building where the lights were still on. I knew that inside Jacob and Paula were planning their next move, but in my heart, something was clear. They could take the company, but they would never take away the faith and integrity I had passed on to the next generation. I couldn't sleep that night. The soft ticking of the wall clock in the dark room reminded me that every second brought me closer to the decision George had laid before me. 48 hours to choose. I got up. I put on a robe and went out to the porch. The city glowed, but it felt strange. In all these years, I had never looked at it through the eyes of a man free from worry. I had always watched it from my office window, like the guardian of the castle I had built, afraid someone would come to take it from me. But tonight, I didn't feel fear, only sadness. I've spent my whole life protecting things, and now those same things have become my chains. The light from a street lamp illuminated her photo, reflecting her gentle smile. For an instant, I thought I heard her familiar voice. "You just need to hold on to your dignity, John. Everything else will work itself out." I went back inside, opened an old closet, and took out the folder George had sent over that afternoon. The sales portfolio for the company, the clauses, the powers of attorney, and even the draft of a letter I would leave for Jacob. I put it all on the table, my hands shaking. I read every line, feeling as if I were reading my own will. Every word was cold, legal, with no room for emotion, but each one carried an old wound. Next to the folder, I placed Mary's notebook. I reread the last page she had written. "Honey, if one day you feel alone in the midst of your own achievements, remember that happiness isn't found within the walls of a company, but in the people who still truly love you." I closed the notebook and took a deep breath. Maybe I would never cut wood again, but at least I would still be the man who had built something with his own two hands. Just at midnight, I sat at the desk, turned on the lamp, and began to write. "Jacob, my son, tomorrow you might be angry. You might hate me. But one day, when you have your own children, you will understand. There are things a father does, not for revenge, but to reteach the lesson you forgot." When I finished, I looked up. A light rain had begun to fall. The sound of the drops on the roof was steady and soft, like the calm heartbeat of someone who has survived a lifetime of storms. I knew the next day wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be tears, anger, and maybe even an irreparable break. But I also knew one thing. After the storm, the sun always comes out again. I turned off the light, put away the whiskey glass, and turned to whisper to Mary, "Tomorrow, I'm putting an end to all of this. But I'm also starting over. Not for the company, for me." And as I walked into my bedroom, I felt something with total clarity. My heart, though full of scars, had finally found the peace to wait for the dawn of a new life. The next morning, I woke up just as the sun was peeking through the window. The first light of day cast a golden, soft glow on the wall, the color of memories. I put on the white shirt Mary had picked out for me to celebrate the company's 20th anniversary. Over time, it had lost some of its brightness, but it still held the faint scent of soap she loved. Today, I wasn't wearing it to impress anyone. I was wearing it to remind myself that I was doing the right thing. At 8 o'clock sharp, George Hill arrived. He carried a thick briefcase full of documents, his eyes swollen from staying up all night preparing the paperwork. "Everything is ready, John," he said, his voice calm but serious. "Before you sign, I need you to understand that as of today, this company will no longer belong to you. There is no going back. This cannot be undone." I nodded slightly, trying to stay calm. "I've already lost much more than that, George. At least this time, I'm the one choosing how I lose it." He looked at me for a moment, then opened the folder. I read every clause slowly. The transfer of rights, the assets, the non-disclosure agreements, and even the provisions for the staff. The buyer was an international conglomerate, Reed Corporation, contacted by George himself. They were a trusted partner, willing to pay $1.2 million via an immediate wire transfer within 48 hours. I signed every page. Every stroke of the pen felt like a cut. I listened to the scratch of the pen on the paper and felt a pain in my chest, as if I were signing my own heart away. When I signed the last sheet, George gently collected the documents and whispered, "It's done." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. A soft breeze came through the window, carrying the sound of birds from the garden. I thought of Mary. If she were alive, she would probably be sad, but she would also understand. I had chosen to free myself, not for revenge, but to end a chain of pain. I turned to George and asked, "Do you think I was cruel?" He managed a melancholic smile. "Cruel to whom, John? To your son? Or to yourself, for putting up with this your whole life without fighting back?" I smiled slightly. Maybe to both, but at least this time, I did it for me. George put the documents in his briefcase and stood up. "They will complete the transfer in the next 2 days. I'll let you know as soon as it's all set." Before leaving, he put a hand on my shoulder. "I've known you for 28 years, John, and this is the first time I've ever seen you look so peaceful. Wherever she is, Mary is proud of you." When the door closed, I was alone. The office was so quiet it felt like the whole world had stopped. I looked around. Every wall, every object, everything bore the imprint of the years I had lived. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was shining on the trees with a blinding light. I took a deep breath, feeling as if someone had just untied a knot in my chest. For the first time in 45 years, I was no longer the owner of Harrison Woodworking, and strangely, I didn't feel a sense of loss. I just felt light. So light that I could breathe deeply without being afraid of anything. I looked up at the sky and smiled to myself. "Mary, I kept my promise. I didn't let them trample our legacy. I don't have the company anymore, but I still have my soul." And for the first time in many, many years, I felt truly free. That afternoon, I sat in my office and watched the company parking lot. The golden sun reflected off the cars, casting shadows of the people bustling below. At 5 o'clock sharp, Jacob's familiar black BMW pulled into the lot. I recognized the sound of its engine immediately. I had given him that car for his 40th birthday. That day, I told him, "I'm giving you this car not for its value, but in the hope that you'll drive it with your heart, not with your ambition." Now the sound of that engine felt like a mockery. Jacob got out of the car, followed by Paula. They both looked radiant, tanned from a vacation in the Caribbean. They were talking and laughing, without the slightest idea that their world was about to fall apart. I watched them from the second floor, watching Paula cling to Jacob's arm, her shiny hair blowing in the afternoon sun, while he held his phone tightly, his gaze full of the confidence of someone who believes tomorrow belongs to him. I didn't go down to greet them. I wanted to witness this scene as a spectator, to burn their faces into my memory before everything changed forever. When they got in the elevator, I went back to my desk, opened the cabinet, and took out the envelope containing copies of the company's sales contract. George had warned me, "They will come in with a plan to push you aside. You will show them what it means to lose everything in a single sentence." Around 6, the phone rang. It was Jacob's voice, sweet but artificial. "Dad, Paula and I wanted to invite you to dinner tomorrow. There's an important matter about the future of the company that I think you'll be happy to hear." I smiled to myself and answered calmly, "Of course, son. I have some news to share too. It will be a memorable night." Maybe he thought I already suspected his plan because his voice faltered for an instant. "What news?" "You'll find out when you come," I said quietly. Surprises are always more interesting, don't you think? I hung up and poured myself a glass of whiskey. The sunset light reflected in the glass, staining the liquid an amber color, beautiful and bitter. I took a small sip and closed my eyes, hearing Mary's voice resonate somewhere in my mind. "John." Sometimes silence is the most powerful answer. I nodded slightly, as if I were talking to her. I got up and walked into the hallway, looking at the offices that were slowly going dark. For so many years, this place had been my entire life. I had walked these halls with pride, convinced I was creating a legacy for my son to continue. But that legacy was no longer a gift. It had become a burden, cracking the relationship between a father and son. Day after day, night fell, and the city lit up. I closed my office door, went out to the courtyard, and took a deep breath. The night wind carried the smell of wood from the old shop, the most familiar scent of my life. I looked up at the second floor, where Jacob and Paula were laughing in their office. Under the yellowish light, they looked like two actors rehearsing a play whose ending I had already written. "Tomorrow," I whispered, "will be the last time we speak as father and son." I squeezed the key in my hand, then let it go, with the same lightness that I was leaving 45 long years behind. And when the car door closed behind me, I knew for certain I wasn't just leaving the company. I was also leaving behind the last illusions I had about a father's unconditional love. The next morning, I arrived at the company earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and the sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the deserted hallways. This wasn't just any other day. I knew that by the time the sun set, Jacob's life would be changed forever. I made a cup of coffee. I inhaled its aroma deeply and sat at my desk. I placed the folder with the sales contract in front of me, carefully organized by George. Everything was finalized. All that was left was for the new owners to take possession. I looked at the clock. 8:40 a.m. In 2 hours, it would all be officially over. At 8:50 a.m., the door opened. Jacob walked in, followed by Paula. They were both impeccably dressed, their faces serious but with a contained excitement in their eyes. "Good morning, Dad," Jacob said, his tone a bit forced. "Paula and I wanted to talk to you before the meeting." I nodded slightly and gestured to the chairs. "Sit down. I have some things to tell you, too." Jacob opened his briefcase and took out a stack of documents. "Dad, we've thought about this a lot. You've worked your entire life, and it's time for you to rest. The company needs new blood. I've prepared the entire plan so the transition can happen smoothly. Of course, you'll remain as the honorary chairman." Paula added in a voice so soft it was fake, "We just want you to rest and enjoy your retirement. Jacob will take care of everything." I remained silent, letting them talk. Jacob's voice was full of confidence, as if he were presenting a project to a partner, not to the person who gave him life. I looked at my son, and I no longer saw the boy who ran through the park holding my hand. I saw a man who had let ambition eclipse love. When they finished, I smiled. "It's a good plan," I said, my voice serene. "But before we talk about the future of the company, I have a little news to share." I took a thick envelope from the drawer and slid it gently across the table toward them. "You should read this carefully." Jacob frowned and opened it. Within seconds, his expression went from confidence to absolute disbelief. Paula leaned over to look and gripped the edge of the paper tightly. "Dad, what is this?" I leaned back in my chair, my gaze calm. "It's the sales contract for the company. Harrison Woodworking no longer belongs to me, or to you. Yesterday I signed the sale of all my shares to the Reed Corporation." The air seemed to freeze. Jacob stared at me, his eyes wide, babbling. You can't have done that. It's the family legacy." I nodded gently. "Yes, it was the family legacy. Until you turned it into a chessboard to eliminate your own father. You were planning to have me declared incompetent, weren't you? Well, that's a shame, because this mind is still lucid enough to sell it all before you could act." Paula stood up, trying to keep her composure. "John, we can talk about this again. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." I cut her off in the same calm tone. "There is no misunderstanding. In fact, the representatives from the buying corporation are arriving right now. You can stay and welcome them, or you can go home and reorganize your lives. The choice is yours." Jacob clenched his fists, shaking with rage. "You've destroyed everything. Out of a fit of anger?" I looked him straight in the eye and replied serenely, "No, son. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it out of self-respect. You could take everything I had except that." Footsteps were heard in the hallway. It was George, with the representatives from Reed Corporation. I heard each of their steps like the ticking of a clock, marking the beginning of a new era. Jacob froze, and Paula lowered her head. I took a sip of my now cold coffee, feeling the bitterness spread on my tongue. It was the taste of the end, but also the taste of freedom. "You wanted to grow up, Jacob?" I said quietly. No trace of anger left. "Well, today you're going to learn the first lesson of being an adult. Every action has a consequence." The door to the conference room swung open. 3 men in dark suits entered, their faces serious but kind. At their head was a man in his 50s, tall, with a sharp but warm gaze. He approached me and held out his hand. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Oscar Reed. It's an honor to finally meet you in person." I stood up and shook his hand firmly. "The honor is mine," I replied calmly. "I hope the company thrives even more under your direction." Jacob and Paula looked at each other, unable to believe what they were hearing. Jacob's gaze darted from me to the group of newcomers, as if searching for a crack in this nightmare. "You are—" Jacob stammered, his voice choked. "Yes," I answered. "They are the ones who bought Harrison Woodworking. As of today, they are the new owners of this place." A heavy silence fell over the room. Paula tried to force a smile, but her lips were trembling. "John, this can surely be renegotiated, right? We could reach an agreement." I shook my head gently. "No, Paula. The contract is signed, notarized, and the wire transfer is complete. Everything is legal." Oscar Reed placed his briefcase on the table and turned to Jacob with a polite smile. "You must be Jacob Harrison. I've heard a lot about you. Your father is a man of extraordinary vision." Jacob tried to stand, but his voice broke. "Yes, but I'm still the director here." Oscar looked at me, then replied softly, "I'm afraid not. With the change in ownership, the entire board of directors will be restructured." He paused. "However, if you wish to continue working with us, we could consider a suitable position for you." That sentence was a direct blow to Jacob's pride. He clenched his fists tightly, his eyes red. "Are you offering me a job in my own father's company?" Oscar maintained his calm tone. "No. I'm offering you the opportunity to work in a business you've contributed to. Of course, the decision is yours." I watched my son. The anger was burning in him, but behind that look, I saw fear, loss, and a hint of regret he wasn't yet able to recognize. Paula grabbed his hand, trying to get him to sit, but Jacob yanked it away. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice broken. "What have you done? You've destroyed this family's future, all for your stupid pride." I didn't answer. I just looked at him in silence. You don't get it, Jacob. I didn't destroy anything. I just reclaimed what you two threw away. Respect. Paula slammed her hand on the table and hissed, Are you trying to leave us ruined? I offered a faint smile. No. I just want you to learn how to start from scratch. Like I did once, with empty hands and a little dignity. Jacob lowered his head, trembling, as his lips moved without making a sound. I watched the first tear fall from his eye, roll down his cheek, and disappear. The sight pained me, but not out of regret, out of compassion. The father in me wanted to hug him, but the man I was knew that sometimes you have to let someone hit rock bottom so they can learn to stand up. Oscar Reed gave me a nod and left the room with his legal team, leaving the three of us alone in the silence. I looked at Jacob and, in a low, gravelly voice, said, Son, this isn't my victory. It's your lesson. In life, nobody truly loses everything unless they lose themselves. I stood up, picked up a paper that had fallen on the table, the old photo of the two of us in front of the first shop. I left it in front of Jacob and walked out of the room. Behind me, I heard his sobs mixed with the sound of the rain that was beginning to fall outside, the sound of a chapter that had just closed. That afternoon, it poured. The rain came suddenly, hard, as if the sky wanted to wash away everything left over from that long, chaotic day. I stood by the second-floor window, watching the drops hit the pavement, dissolving the tire marks from the BMW that Jacob had just driven away. For a moment, it felt as if the entire company was breathing the last breath of an era. My era. I walked slowly down the hall, past the offices I used to stop by every morning, where I had laughed, yelled, and taught people to work with honesty. Every wall, every door seemed to whisper goodbye. When I went down to the warehouse, the intense smell of damp wood enveloped me. There I stopped in front of an old workbench, the first one I had built with my own hands. The surface was scratched, but the saw marks were still visible. I ran my hand over it gently, feeling as if I were touching a part of my own skin. The memories flooded back, the sleepless nights, the times Mary brought me dinner, a little Jacob sitting beside me, laughing his head off every time I pretended to get a splinter. I whispered, I've lost the company, but its soul is still here, in the grain of this wood. I couldn't keep it anymore. It had stopped being my company a long time ago. He approached, a mix of surprise and compassion in his eyes. But do you regret it? I looked out the window, toward the highway that the rain was washing white. No, I only regret not doing it sooner. Regret? Maybe I regret not teaching Jacob that there are things that, once lost, you can't buy back, like trust, or a father's love. Michael fell silent. He pulled his old lighter from his pocket, sparked it, and snapped it shut. I've worked with you for 15 years, John. I've never heard you say anything without thinking it through. But today, seeing you like this, I realized something. For the first time, you're not the boss. You're a free man. I smiled slightly. Maybe that's it, Michael. I've spent my whole life creating, preserving, and protecting. Now I'm learning to let go. We stood together for a while, saying nothing else. The rain fell with a steady rhythm, blurring all the other sounds of the world. When Michael left, I looked at the workshop one last time. A few drops of water were leaking through the corrugated roof, falling onto the cement floor, forming a small stream that trickled toward the exit. I thought that maybe people are like the rain. They have to fall, to dissolve, to find their own way. I left the company without looking back. Under the gray rain, my shoulders felt incredibly light. I had lost everything that could be measured in money, but in exchange, I found something I had never achieved in my entire life: peace. The next morning, I went back to the company one last time to pick up my personal belongings. The office was strangely quiet. The walls, once covered in awards and family photos, were now bare, showing only the nail holes. I packed each item into a cardboard box, a few notebooks, an old fountain pen, the desk clock Mary gave me on the 10th anniversary of the shop. Each object was a piece of my life, and as the box filled up, I felt as if I were packing my entire youth into one small space. A soft knock came at the door. I turned and saw Isabella. She was soaked from the rain, hugging her thin jacket, her eyes red. "Grandpa," she called, her voice trembling. "My dad told me. Is it true? Did you sell the company?" I smiled sadly and nodded. "Yes, I sold it." Isabella shook her head and tears welched up in her eyes. "Dad says you're crazy, that you destroyed the family because of your pride. But I don't believe him. I know you did it for something more important." I walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, sometimes adults have to do things that others don't understand right away. But I'm not crazy, and I haven't destroyed anything. I just decided to keep the part of me I wasn't willing to lose." Isabella looked up at me with her clear eyes. "Your dignity, right, Grandpa?" I nodded slightly. "Yes, and also the little love I had left. You know, sometimes even love has to have limits, or else it just becomes humiliation." She hugged me tightly. I felt her shoulders shake, and the smell of her damp hair, the same shampoo Mary used to use, enveloped me. I stroked her hair, a lump in my throat. "Isabella, I don't know what will happen in the future. Maybe your father will hate me forever. Maybe this family will break. But I want you to remember that I will never ask you to choose sides. You just need to hold on to your kindness, even if the world around you changes." Isabella squeezed my hand and nodded. "Grandpa, I'm just afraid we won't be a family anymore." Her words cut straight to my heart. I bent down and looked her deep in the eyes. "Sweetheart, a real family isn't about 4 walls or property. It's here." I placed my hand on her chest. "In the place where you still know how to love and trust. As long as you love me, as long as you remember what Grandma Mary taught you, we will always be a family." She broke down, burying her head in my shoulder. I let her tears soak my shirt, feeling a mixture of pain and warmth. In that instant, I felt Mary was close, smiling as she watched us. When Isabella calmed down, I gave her an old photograph. Mary, a young Jacob, and me, posing in front of the first workshop. "Keep this," I told her, "so you remember that this place was born from love, not ambition." She clutched the photo and nodded slightly. "I promise I won't let anyone forget." When she left, I watched her through the window. Her small figure disappeared into the drizzle, but in my heart, the light she radiated spread like the first ray of sun after a storm. I knew that, even if Jacob closed his heart to me forever, at least there was someone left in our bloodline who understood that love and kindness still had a place in the world. The day I officially left the company, the sky was strangely clear. There were no more phone calls, no more endless meetings, no more prying eyes. I drove down the tree-lined road I had traveled for decades, leaving the industrial park with the lightness of someone who has just shed a 1,000-pound weight. That afternoon, George called me with the news. "All the paperwork is complete, John. The money has been transferred to your account." I barely replied. "Thanks, my friend. Now I can finally breathe." I didn't plan on retiring forever. I just wanted to live the last years of my life as a free man, without the tethers of work or expectations. I contacted Elena, the real estate agent George had recommended. She took me to see a house in the suburbs. 2 stories, white walls, a small backyard, and a wooden porch with a view of the mountains. When I walked in, I heard the chirping of birds and smelled the damp earth, the scent of real life. "Is there anything special about this house?" Elena asked. I smiled. "Yes, it's quiet, and it doesn't remind me of the past." I bought the house that same day, without haggling. That night, when I opened the window, a cool breeze entered the room. I made a cup of coffee and sat, listening to the rustling leaves. I had spent my whole life looking out for everyone else's peace, but this was the first time I was living to find my own. The first day of the move, Isabella came to help. She ran all over the yard, shouting with joy when she saw an apple tree loaded with fruit. "Grandpa, this place is beautiful. I'll help you plant more flowers, okay?" I nodded, smiling slightly. "You can do whatever you want, as long as this place is full of laughter." She looked at me with her bright eyes and said quietly, "Now you have a real home, not an office." That night we sat together on the porch, listening to the wind blow over the roof. Isabella told me about school, and I listened in silence. Her laughter echoed in the night, as clear as the music Mary used to love, and I realized maybe happiness isn't found in spreadsheets, but in simple moments like this, where you can look at someone and feel that your life hasn't been in vain. A week later, I received an unexpected call from Reed Corporation. I recognized Oscar's voice on the other end. "Mr. Harrison, we'd like to invite you to lunch. We have something important to propose." We met at a small restaurant downtown. Oscar looked at me with respect. "We've reviewed the entire history of the company, the way you built this brand. It's admirable. I have a proposal. Would you like to come back, not as an owner, but as an honorary consultant?" I laughed. "Aren't you worried I'm too old?" Oscar shook his head. "No. We need your wisdom, not your youth. You understand the heart of people, and that's something every corporation is missing." I thought about it for a moment and nodded. "I'll help you, but on one condition. You treat the employees fairly. They are the real soul of the company, not the quarterly reports." Oscar smiled. "It's a deal, sir." That afternoon, I visited the old headquarters for the first time since I left. The new sign, Reed Corporation, was already hanging, bright and shiny. Many of the old employees were still there. They ran over to greet me, a mixture of joy and nostalgia in their eyes. I walked down the hallway, which was once a battlefield of ambitions, and now only evoked the breath of the past. In the office, Michael greeted me with a strong hug. "You're back?" I smiled. "Not completely. I just came to make sure this place keeps its soul." As I was leaving, Oscar called to me from the door. "We're thinking of creating a scholarship in Mary Harrison's name for the employees' children. What do you think?" I stopped, a knot of emotion in my throat. "I think," I said quietly, "Mary would be smiling." That night, back at my new house, I sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky orange. Isabella sent me a text. "Grandpa, they told me they named a scholarship after Grandma. I'm so proud of you." I just replied, "No, sweetheart, I'm the one who's proud of you." That night I took out paper and my old fountain pen and set them on the table. I had written many contracts and many letters in my life, but this time I was writing for myself. Today I turn 71. I have loved, I have lost, and I have forgiven. I once believed my career was proof of my worth, but I've realized that true worth lies in how we love and are loved. I sold the company not for revenge, but to preserve the soul of this family, something money can't buy. If Jacob ever reads this letter, I hope he understands that I hold no resentment. I only wish for him to learn that power without compassion is just an empty shell. And to you, Isabella, my dear granddaughter, if you read this, remember that love is always stronger than hate. You are the most beautiful part left of this family. Live with the heart you've given your grandfather. I set the pen down, folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and placed it next to the old photograph. Mary, Jacob, and me, in a time when we were happy. I went out to the porch and looked at the sky. A soft night breeze carried the smell of damp earth and jasmine. In the firmament, the stars shined like Mary's eyes, watching me. I whispered, "Do you see, Mary? I finally learned how to live, not to be the owner of everything, but to be at peace." In the rustle of the wind, I thought I heard her answer, as soft as a sigh. "I'm still here, John." I closed my eyes and smiled. Inside the small house, the light was still on. Outside, a new dawn was beginning to break, and I knew that, even though my life had reached the end of one road, in my heart, a new chapter had truly just begun.